Hi, Socials 322. Welcome back from spring break. Yesterday I learned what's probably one of the biggest downsides to doing an online class, and that is the fact that when my sound gives out, and I'm checking it again right now, you guys are completely aware of that, and I am completely unaware. So thanks to Omira, who had the courtesy to email me and say that during viewing, halfway through my first video part of this lecture, the audio just kicked out. So I'm doing this lecture again. I've taken down the old one. I'll be loading this one back up. And today's lecture is basically kind of a wrap up of the first half of the course, and then kind of bringing us into the rest of the course. We're actually more than halfway through. And if you recall, the first half of the course was a number of kind of especially theoretical topics about what religion is to sociologists and how different aspects of religion, beliefs, rituals, different practices can be a part of the religious meaning system and the religious structure of groups. In your last quiz that you had just before break, we were studying church-sect theory. So I want to try and wrap that idea up, because this idea is actually important moving forward, because much of what we're doing moving forward is exploring kind of practical instances or very tangible instances of how religion, that could be religious groups, religious individuals, interact with other social institutions in the world. I'll have more to say about this in the next lecture, but this is kind of a nice bridging topic to get us there. So the key question that we have for today, and I'll zoom in here really quick, is why do religious organizations look the way they do? Now, this might be one of those questions that feels like it's so painfully obvious, it's not clear why we're even talking about it. Popular answers to this, when people think about religious organizations, they'll say things like, well, people chose to make a religious organization a certain way, or there's a law that says a religious organization has to look a certain way. But as sociologists, we're actually going to play around with a few theoretical ideas of forces that actually may kind of cause religious organizations to look certain ways. And let me give you a few examples of why this is interesting. Well, first off, you remember we read about Scientology when we talked a little bit about cults a couple weeks ago. Now, something that's really interesting about this group is that it's closed off, for the most part, from kind of public inspection. It's generally a small group of people, very kind of particular meeting places where they meet at. Sometimes you'll see these in urban areas. Living in LA, I've actually seen a couple of Scientology places. It's a new religious group, so there's not much sense with this group that there's a long kind of religious tradition that it's reforming from. So that's one type of religious organization we might look at and see as we're driving down the road. But then there are some very different types. Think for a second especially about the history of the Christian religious tradition in the world and in this country. We have two very different examples just off the top of my head of how religious organizations in the same religious tradition look differently. Now, this is important because it tells us something about the reality that it's not just internal things, or it's not just one kind of internal idea in a religious group that structures the organization, but it's a whole kind of panoply of things, which is what this lecture will be about. But here are the two examples. If you've ever been to Europe or even in this country, in some places there's a lot of Catholic churches. These Catholic churches tend to be a little larger in size. Catholic churches in general tend to have more people than other churches in terms of gathering in one spot. There might be more of other types of churches, but Catholic churches tend to be kind of sizable wherever they plant. Catholic churches throughout history have, especially in Europe, have tended to basically be supportive of state authorities, and even at times have kind of linked closely of church and state. And Catholic churches, in terms of their own kind of theological system, they like to baptize individuals soon after they're born to bring them into that community. Well, in the exact same tradition, we have a group called the Quakers, who you might have heard of before. The Quakers tend to be very small groups. They tend to they don't have a hierarchical authority system. So if you ever get a chance to go to a Quaker church, they're fascinating in that there's no set kind of leader of the ceremony. The group often sits in quiet and kind of waits in kind of a democratic way for religious inspiration. Quaker groups historically have been very resistant to state authorities to the point of being pacifists and not fighting in wars. And Quaker groups tend to be basically replenished by adult choosing to enter the church. So they don't focus as much on infant baptism, but on bringing adults in and making a commitment to this religious group. So the long story short here is that we have, even within the same tradition, different styles of religious organization. And our question is, why the heck do they look the way they do? Let me make a quick note to myself to make sure I don't forget something. Okay, so there's basically, what I like to suggest is basically kind of 4 schools of thought about church sect theory. And when I say church sect theory, that's really an umbrella term for kind of a range of theories that I'm about to now cover that are all trying to explain what the heck happens to make religious organizations look the way they do. Now, it's important to note, and in the context of this lecture and of this theory, pretty much all of it is about Western Christianity. So you know, which is frustrating because it's not clearly applicable to religious organizations and other societies. Those have increasingly been studied by sociologists. So I'll basically suggest that we have kind of three or four, let's see how many I put, ways to think about church sect theory. The first, which is kind of the original way, is kind of a theology way of thinking. This is connected with a guy named Ernst Troeltsch. That is a name you'll probably never hear in passing in the street. Ernst Troeltsch was actually a neighbor, if you will, of Max Weber in the late 1800s in Germany. He was a theologian, and he looked at Christian groups throughout time and said, you know what, I basically think they fall into 3 groups. And he called these groups church, sect, and mystic. And what was important for his purposes is he connected these 3 types to different groups that appeared in Christian religious history, and he made an argument that it was the theological interpretation of members of these groups that caused them to want to form these groups in certain ways. So let me give you an example. What he basically said, well, if you look at in Christian history, we've got, say, for example, the Catholic Church, which is this large institution connected to the state, hierarchical, built on the model of the Roman military system in terms of having regional leaders and a supreme international leader. And then we have these sect groups, which I've mentioned already with the Quakers, which tend to be spin-offs of other religious groups, tend to be small, tend to be in tension with society, and tend to have adults in them. And then we have this mystic category, which are more kind of groups that remove and oftentimes are very individualistic and concentrated on just spiritual matters, not worldly affairs. Now, Troeltsch found all this, as I mentioned, really in the Christian scriptures. So on the website, I printed out for you the sheet where it said examples of church and sect tendencies in Christian scriptures. I'll zoom in really quick. And you can take a look at that, and you see I've tried to divide out evidence for at least these 2 types in the Christian scriptures. So under sect-like tendencies, this new religious leader in these Christian scriptures says, there's now a new criteria for religious community membership. So this new religious leader called Jesus says it's no longer your mother and brother who are important to you, but actually they're your community of other believers who should become like your mother and brother. This same religious leader at one point says, don't worry about normal daily activities, so don't really worry about the concerns of this world, that'll all take off. Another passage on this handout, this religious leader says, leave all your normal roles and occupations. So if you're a fisherman, drop the fisher nets and just come be a part of this religious message, religious community that is happening right now at this point in history. So those are all ways that we understand a sect kind of breaks with the normal routine of society, breaks with normal authority structures, and actually is trying to generate what they often feel is kind of a more pure or more distilled religious vision. And you contrast that, and I give you one scripture passage of the church-like tendency where the biblical figure of Jesus points to another figure, in this case Peter, and says, I'm establishing